thank you to the organizers, first of all, for inviting me and for allowing me to talk about a topic that in some senses is a bit strange and a bit sort of an odd one out in what we're trying to do here. Because I want to talk about freight transports and gender. And there's very good reasons why, and I'll explain those in a minute. But I just would like to sort of acknowledge the contribution of my colleague Debbie Hopkins. She's been very centrally involved in this research. Actually, she's doing the main work. We're still very much working on this project, but I think we've got enough to at least give you some thoughts about why we think this is a relevant topic. Now, I've been doing research on gender and mobility on and off for about 12 years. All my research so far has been on sort of passenger mobility, but actually there's very good reasons to focus on freight, and I've listed 5 of those here. One is that freight transport is very strongly male-dominated, and I've got a few statistics in a minute. There's also very big issues, at least in the UK, with recruitment and retention of personnel, drivers in particular. I think that's a broader issue, but particularly in the UK, this is a very significant issue. Not least because one of the ways in which the UK has fixed some of its problems in the labour market is by basically having Eastern Europeans come over, and now with Brexit that is causing all sorts of issues. So this is now a big issue on the UK policy agenda. Freight, from an academic point of view, is I think quite interesting because there is very little work by social scientists on gender. There's now sort of a nascent literature on cargo mobilities, and Nikki Gregson is a very well-known feminist geographer, has recently been doing some ethnography with truck drivers, but there is very little work on gender and freight. And if you know of anything, please do let me know, because we're really struggling to find some. Freight is also interesting because one of the things that you see in all this discourse about smart mobility in the smart city is that people don't talk about freight. They talk about mobility, but that's really about the likes of Uber, the likes of all sorts of other apps. They don't talk about freight. And this is significant because the whole urban agenda in transport and the whole urban sustainable mobility agenda is very problematic from a freight point of view, because we have lorries, vans that need to go somewhere, and they're very, very big issues. So I think it's an interesting topic. At the same time, we see a very clear movement towards the incorporation of all sorts of IT and automated technologies within this sector, and I think that too raises a number of different questions. Now, I spoke about sort of the male dominance of the sector, and that's something that you can very clearly see in this stat. This is only looking at LGVs, so light good vehicles. So that's essentially a lorry, smaller than 3.5 ton. 1 in 12 drivers is female. If you look at trucks, the figures are lower. If you look at rail, the figures are lower. It's very difficult to get reliable statistics, but it's quite clear it's very strongly male-dominated. There's an age dimension to that, because if you sort of look at the age composition of female drivers, you see that they're more likely to be younger. So it's particularly among the older generation that we see this very, very big shift, a very large difference. I spoke about sort of this issue of driver recruitment, driver retention, a big issue in the UK at the moment, to such an extent that Parliament has instituted an inquiry specifically into labour market issues in the road haulage sector. And what has happened is that there's been a committee of MPs, members of Parliament, who have done an independent inquiry. What they've done is they've gathered evidence from many different stakeholders in the industry and so on. And they've written a report. And what they say, sort of this is from the, these are 2 excerpts from the summary of that report, is that they say, first of all, there's a very significant driver shortage, about 45 to 60k, which amounts to about 20% of the total employment in this sector. So this is a significant issue. They also argue that part of the way this can be resolved is by appealing beyond the usual suspects when we think about new recruits. So there's a big emphasis on the need to require drivers from minority backgrounds and also more female drivers. And they recommend a number of ways in which that can be done that concern training, that are sort of focused on reducing the cost, the financial barriers of the acquisition of a driving license, which is very, very expensive in the UK, and improving facilities for drivers. What they're effectively talking about is about stops along the motorway, because those are seen as very poor quality and also as very gender unfriendly, you could say. I think this is a very interesting report, but also think it's not going far enough when we sort of think about issues of gender and diversity. So what we want to do as part of this study is look at this intersection of gender and digital technology. I'll talk more about how we understand smart mobility digital economy in a minute. But I just want to flesh out that we focus on gender, and we very much appreciate the importance of intersectionality. And it is actually there because I'm not only talking about gender, I'm also talking about issues of ethnicity, age, class. But for this presentation, I decided to focus on the gender dimension and sort of work with the sort of Judith Butler's understanding of gender as this apparatus by which the masculine and the feminine gets produced and constantly stabilized. And we focus on this sort of intersection in part because, going back here, there's nothing on new technology here. So I think one of the things in the report by the House of Commons is that there's sort of not any attention for the role of smart technologies and technological change in all of this. The study is based essentially on a study of an examination of expert discourses. So we've done analysis of a range of different government documents, but we've also done 19 interviews with experts in from a range of different backgrounds, including transport operators, interest groups in freight, think tanks, technology developers, entrepreneurs, people in government, who sort of have a broad brush overview of what's going on in the sector. The focus is mostly on a national level here. In the next phases of the project, we'll look at sort of what's happening at the urban level, and we're also going to do interviews with drivers at some point, but we're not quite there yet. And I think from what we have here, we can already say some very interesting things. So in the remainder, what I'll be talking about is sort of these 5 points. I'll say a little bit about freight in the UK context, really some very basic statistics before moving on the issue of smart transport and automation in the freight sector, then talk about how subject positions are being produced in freight, talk about sort of this intersection between smart automation and gender, and finally make some very preliminary remarks about what a politics for freight mobility might look like. The boring bit of the statistics then, just really, really basic. If you look at sort of the top figure, it's quite clear that when we talk about freight, domestic freight in the UK context, we're talking about roads. 88% of ton kilometers, so this is distance sort of corrected for differences in the weight of the volume of what gets transported. It's only about 1/8 of all kilometers is rail. Waterways is sort of, you can very easily disregard, but it's mostly road. If we look at road, we see that it's primarily vans and a smaller share of lorries. I apologize for those at the back, but I hope you can see, because what this figure shows, sort of this is total miles driven, that about 15% of all miles driven within the UK, no, this is probably Great Britain, let's call it Great Britain, not the UK. We can talk about the difference later. Great Britain, about 15% of all mileage is driven by lorries, and about 5% is driven by, 15% by vans, 5% by lorries. But what we see is sort of, if we look at the trend over the last 10 years, is that after a dip post-economic crisis, we see that especially over the last 5 years, there's been a very rapid growth in vans. And that's mostly due to the increase in home delivery, so the Amazons of this world. But increasingly also grocery shopping is being done, or at least delivered at home in the UK. I think the UK stands out in a European context about in terms of what percentage of grocery shopping actually gets delivered. So I think that's quite an interesting development, and I think whatever happens post-Brexit, I think these trends will probably continue into the future. Then I think it's important to think about freight as a very differentiated sector, and there's many ways you can cut it, but one way that I found quite useful and that we got from one of the interviews is sort of think about differences in terms of scale and in terms of the nature of freight movement. And I think what I've done, I've messed up the words on the axis. Because the scale is obviously the vertical dimension. You've got the very large TNCs, like UPS or the big supermarkets. And here you got the one-man operation. I thought I leave the one man in because that's the way people in the freight industry tend to talk about this. It's not one person, it's sort of this very masculine discourse. Where you, for instance, got the self-employed driver who drives for DPD is one of the big freight companies in the UK. And it's kind of a gig economy, Uber-type labor relations, where the drivers are not sort of employees, but they're self-employed and then they're hired by the company. And then on the other axis, you got sort of the nature of the freight movement, because on the one hand, you got the pure logistics companies for whom freight is the core of their business, whilst at the other end, you got people, companies that just need to move stuff around. So this is where you have, for instance, people in the building sector, or indeed supermarkets, who have to sort of move their goods, their products around in order to do their core business. I think this is a useful way of thinking about it, because if we think about smart mobility, if we think about digital technologies, we think about innovations, there are clear differences between these four quadrants. And I think it's here where we see the largest interest in technological innovation. Also the most resources for taking on some of these innovations. Whereas here, we've got very small companies, very tight profit margins. Many of these innovations are simply not affordable or are deemed too risky. I think there's a perfectly rational explanation for that. But this is important if we think about questions of innovation. What does smart mobility in the freight context mean? Well, I think we need to start with the question, what is smart mobility in the first place? And the term is very easily used, but there are actually very few rigorous definitions of what it is. And this is a paper by Glenn Lyons. Glenn Lyons is one of the leading transport researchers on sort of the intersection of society and transport from UEE. Everyone must know him quite well. And I think it's sort of this quote is actually quite spot on, that we talk very easily about it, but often it's not clear what is being meant, whether we talk about the academic literature or whether we talk about the wider discourse. And actually, when we asked in our interviews to our participants, what does the term smart mobility mean to you? We got some very interesting responses. I think one key response was uncertainty. people don't really know what it is. And when they talk about it, they tend to talk about things like Uber, or they talk about things like information, like here, information that allows sort of intermodality to become more than simply a discourse, but actually something that we can see in reality. But people, I mean, obviously there is Uber Freight these days, and there's sort of Chinese companies who try to do something similar. None of them makes any profit, but it's something that many people are quite interested in. This is a slightly more advanced understanding from that directly relates to freight, and there too the emphasis tends to be at sort of the last mile, if you like. It's about the connection with the customer. So it's about sort of that delivery part of the chain. And according to this person, there's actually very little work in sort of the long distance freight movements. Yeah, obviously this is a sector with its own language, its own vocabulary, but sort of the whole that is sort of really referring to that more intercity long distance travel. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that there is a paradox, because what we see is the gradual migration of all kinds of smart technologies into the sector. And for me, it makes a lot of sense to think about smart mobility as a computational dispositive. Now, the term computational dispositive is not mine, is by a sociologist, Gabris, used in the context of the smart city. Obviously, she derives it from Foucault, who coined the term dispositive. And sort of the way I would sort of phrase this is as an amalgam of digital technologies, discourses, knowledges, materialities, business models, and practices that are organized around one or more problems. And I've just written a chapter on this, but I think it actually, which is more focused on passenger mobility, but I actually think it works quite well for freight transport as well. And that is because there are sort of clear problems that people try to solve with this with these technologies. And in the freight context, that's different from what we see in passenger. In freight, it's about money. It's about cost reduction. It's about efficiency. Efficiency comes first. Safety is a distant second. Then comes air quality, and at the far end, you get greenhouse gas emissions. But it's really about efficiency. It's about cost savings, because this sector is organized around cost minimization. And it's about acceleration, it's about increasing reliability. And the cost structure is actually not that difficult. It's roughly 1/3 fuel, 1/3 labor, 1/3 the rest. So you can see that there is potential, and there is actually interest in autonomous vehicles, because they can potentially get rid of a very large share of that cost. In an ideal world, it's not that simple. I talked about this paradox, and actually what you see is that we have all sorts of digital technologies that have come into the sector. So we got telematics, not my term, but a term that's used quite a lot in our interviews, which allow better monitoring, better evaluation, which can then sort of feed into sort of restructuring, efficiency improvements, what have you. We obviously got technologies to reduce blind spots. Very, very important in the urban context, particularly London, where there is this big moral panic about lorries and vans and dead cyclists or hurt cyclists. So this is very, very important. Very expensive, but very significant. In rail, we have digital signaling. I struggled to find a suitable picture of that. So I ended up with sort of this, which if you look very carefully, you can see that this guy is monitoring all the trains. And again, it's about efficiency, because it helps you reduce the distances in time and also in metric distance between trains. So you can more efficiently use your network. We've got automatic gears in trucks. Very important. because it sort of makes the physical effort of driving a truck much less. And we got all sorts of apps being used. If you look carefully, you see that this is a iPad or a similar device of another manufacturing. I don't want to be privileging Apple, sort of to check loads, check all sorts of things around the vehicle. Again, it's about reducing the physical effort associated with the vehicle. Now, I think all of this is very interesting, but it's quite different from the government discourse in the UK, because the government discourse is very strongly about autonomous vehicles. And there is this big emphasis in UK government discourse on autonomous vehicles, essentially as a business opportunity to make the car industry more competitive in the UK, to provide new innovation, particularly in a context post-financial financial crisis, where there now is this large distrust of the financial sector, and also post-Brexit, where we need to have new engines for economic growth. And according to the government, automation is one of the key sectors, and there's a lot to be gained. And expectations in freight transport are quite high. These are anticipated to increase fuel efficiency, to make freight transport more safe, to reduce noise, reduce air pollution, and to resolve the driver shortage. Evidence, very limited at best. I think this is sort of really about belief. And if we look sort of what we get from our interviews, we actually see that there is a lot of skepticism about these claims. Part of that is because people want to see evidence. This is a sector, I said before, of fierce competition, tight profit margins. They can't risk in investing in something lofty and new. They need to see real benefits. So there's a natural risk aversiveness. There's also a very strong short-term focus in the sector. It's really about sort of the next contract. It's sort of a couple of months. You don't think far ahead into the future, and that's very significant. It's also about investments. If you want to buy a new locomotive, it costs about 2 to 3 million. And they are sort of assumed to be on the track for 50 years. So turnover of vehicle stock is very, very slow. It's obviously slightly different in the in the road sector, but even there, sort of a good lorry costs you about 200 to 300k, and is sort of assumed to be on the road for at least 5 to 10 years. So there's a lot of lock-in in terms of investment. There's also a lock-in in terms of the thinking. But autonomous vehicles are really construed as something of the future. It's not imminent in the way that it is in government discourse. The appeal lies again in the cost savings when no driver is required, because you don't have to have the space on a vehicle for a cab where the driver can stay, where they can sleep. So there's extra space where you can move freight around. You don't have to respect the labor laws, which say that you can only drive a vehicle for so many hours. And you can reduce human error. Again, we don't know what the evidence is, but in theory, this is a very appealing aspect. And once we discussed these issues more deeply with our interviewees, many actually believed that there is a gradual introduction feasible. And that seems like the most natural way of things. But we're talking about timelines that are significantly longer than what you see in either the government discourse or the vehicle manufacturer discourse. Gender then. I've spoken about this committee and sort of this inquiry into the recruitment and retention problem. And they speak specifically in their final report about issues of gender. And they come up with these three sort of key reasons why there's so few women working in the sector. One is that they say the industry fails to recruit beyond those who are already interested in driving. And that's primarily due because the roads freight sector has a very poor reputation in the UK. They say there's an absence of role models for women, which I think is true, but there's also a classic chicken and egg issue, because how do you get role models when you don't have women? And so it's very difficult to get this. And there's an absence of education of what actually the job entails. We've also asked in our interviews what people think are the reasons for this male dominance. There's some overlap, but there are also some differences in terms of what we see. One of the things that comes out very strongly is sort of this emphasis on working times. It's seen as unsociable and very rigid. There's not the flexibility that women purportedly would want. There's, again, the emphasis on inadequate facilities, with toilets being singled out in particular. There is this perceived and actual, the perceived and actual characteristics of the work, which is seen as dirty, picking up heavy things, and so on. Very interestingly, parental resistance. So both mothers and fathers not keen that their daughters moving into this sector. And there's sort of this lack of awareness about the opportunities. I think this is really interesting, but if we look at this a bit more, in a bit more detail and a bit more critical, what we sort of see happening here is that there are all sorts of assumptions about gender and about the feminine being made here. And one is that there is sort of there's a sort of an assumption of very rigid gender roles, very heterosexual gender roles. Women run families. I put it very bluntly, but deliberately, because actually this is one, these things came out very, very strongly when I sort of was doing the analysis of the interview transcript. Sometimes they sort of really jumped off the page. So hence the slightly rude language. There are also very strong assumptions being made about the female body, about limited capacity to do heavy-duty physical work, about a focus on appearance, high standards regarding facilities. There's also very strong overgeneralization. There's no account, no appreciation of the differentiation in capacity, sensations, preferences of bodies and women, or for that matter, men. And actually, the masculine is really the norm. The feminine is effectively the non-masculine. So this is sort of where the thinking of people like Luz Irigaray comes in very, very useful, about the feminine not being imagined on its own terms. So here's the quote, not from Irigaray, but from Elizabeth Gross, which sort of captures this very clearly. She's not talking about freight, but I think it's actually directly applicable to what we're talking about, that there is no space for the existence of two sexes. There's only one sex and its counterpart. Now, you may take issue with the two sexes, there may be more, but the point is that there is essentially only this one sex, and I think that comes very strongly from our interviews, our analysis. And yet, if you look at some of the accounts by women, as part of this inquiry by members of Parliament, this is Natalie Axon. She's director of a recruitment agency, a training agency for drivers, and she's been very long involved in attempts to recruit more female drivers. She's also been driving a truck herself for 20 years. She's actually, in this quote, very nicely sort of reworking this gender apparatus and actually talking about, yes, there are issues of differences in physical strength perhaps, but they're not as big as the discourse suggests, and there are all sorts of ways around it. And for people who are wondering what the orange supermarket is, that's Sainsbury in the UK. So there is sort of much more complexity here at stake than what some of the discourse is telling us. although the discourse is very dominant, very strongly prevailing. What about the role of smart technologies, automation? Then we asked about this in our interviews, and we obviously did the analysis, and I think it's fair to say that there's a range of different views. Some people believe, yes, it can make the job more appealing because it becomes less heavy duty. Sort of think about the automatic steering or gear change. That's a very important one because it sort of makes the physical effort less. There's supposedly less stress of driving, and there's a greater role of customer orientation. Although, again, note that this is a very gendered discourse because the assumption is that women are much better at what Linda McDowell calls body work, sort of this type of care that's provided in customer relations by physical proximity, which again, sort of, the association with the female is very clear. Other people say there's actually, it makes the sector less appealing because the demand for labor will be less. It will have very little effect because high tech is also very male-dominated as a sector. And still others say, well, automation is so far off, we need to sort of focus much more at the here and now. So this is coming back to this point I was making earlier about this very short-term focus of the sector. Actually, from the interviews, it appears that more likely than not, that automation will fail to reconfigure workforce composition or sort of the way femininity and masculinity are being produced. On the other hand, I already noticed sort of this limited time horizon, and I think many people sort of do sort of seem to suggest that other digital technologies, apart from automation, reconfigure bodily capacities. So perhaps there is a space for autonomous vehicle technology to have some unforeseen effects on bodily capacities. A few words have fallen out there. And actually, again, a quote from Natalie Axon, who was sort of saying in her written testimony that, yes, there is sort of the evolution of all sorts of technology that makes driving for women easier. So perhaps there is a bigger role for technology than we currently think. And I think I want to sort of follow up on that, because it seems to me that whilst a lot is going on, at least in the UK context, to try and recruit more female drivers and to increase diversity in the sector, I think that's not really going far enough. More change is needed. And I think this is where this sort of this politics of freight mobility it might be useful to help us think through some of these issues. Now, I have to warn you, this is all very preliminary, and it sort of needs a lot more development in our thinking. But I would sort of like to sort of make three suggestions at this stage. That one of which is sort of that we really need to sort of find ways of creating a space for genuine sexual differences, where the feminine is more than the non-masculine. You may be asking, what then is that feminine? And the answer is that I don't know and I can't tell. I think this is to be elaborated and experimented with in practice. It's not up to me to say what that might be. And I actually think a progressive politics is, after all, best based on the idea that the future is open and underdetermined. For some people that will be a cop-out, but I genuinely believe that we can't, certainly not as academics, make that claim as to what we know what that future would be. It is, however, clear to me that the way the sector considers and practices time and space is a key issue here, because the focus is too strongly on acceleration, the annihilation of space by time, the monetization of both, and there is a widespread myopia. And the causes for these customs may be plausible and understandable, but if real change towards social and environmental sustainability is to be achieved, then imagining and conceptualizing space and time differently is unavoidable. One way in which this might be done is by drawing on the work of thinkers like Bergson, Deleuze, and Elizabeth Gross in philosophy, the likes of Massey, Thrift, and others in geography. But that is not for today to talk about. I would love to talk about that, but I'll leave that for another time. What I would say is that doing, imagining, and conceptualizing time and space differently will not merely open up opportunities for genuine differences to come into being, it would also provide new possibilities for smart technology, including autonomous vehicles, to contribute to greater diversity and differentiation in the UK freight sector. Thank you very much.